This is another type of virus. This is a bee virus, and this one is chronic bee paralysis virus. And you can see it's actually very different to the coronaviruses. This is really quite an unusual type of virus in that it resembles sort of really irregular blobs rather than the very regular virus particles that indeed many of the bee viruses as well as many of the human viruses are. And this virus causes a condition called bee paralysis, which has actually been known about for a very long time indeed. Aristotle describes paralyzed bees, which may well have been caused by chronic bee paralysis virus a very long time ago. But more than 100 years ago, it caused considerable problems. And this is a very old picture from Rothamsted showing the symptoms of chronic bee paralysis virus. This is a healthy bee here. And then there are two syndromes, one a bee with a very distended abdomen and supposedly dislocated wings that's unable to fly. And then the second syndrome is these shiny black bees which have lost all of their hair and have a characteristically greasy appearance. And this is the other symptoms. And both of those were described as symptoms of something called the Isle of Wight disease that occurred more than 100 years ago. And this is a picture of a colony apparently suffering from Isle of Wight disease, and you can see there are crawling bees unable to fly. At the time, this was completely unknown, and then shortly afterwards, the Tracheal Mite Carreck woodi was discovered and was thought to be the cause. But it wasn't really until the 1960s when Leslie Bailey at Rothamsted, with the benefit of modern techniques such as electron microscopes and serological techniques, was able to firstly isolate this chronic paralysis virus, study its characteristics, and conclude that actually this was the cause of the Isle of Wight disease many years ago. Since that time, chronic bee paralysis virus seems to have become less important for a long period of time, and work that Bailey did with a statistician at Rothamsted suggested that the reason it was less important was that people were keeping fewer beehives. And Bailey suggested, looking at the evidence, that there might have been something like 1 million colonies of honeybees in Britain before the First World War, which certainly is a very high density of colonies. We now have about a quarter of that figure. And as I say, the incidence of chronic bee paralysis virus disappeared or diminished for a very long time, until fairly recently. And indeed, members of the Bee Farmers Association over the last 10 years or so began to report that they were frequently seeing chronic bee paralysis virus. And this prompted a piece of work which was published earlier this year, headed by Giles Budge, who many of you will know, who used to be at the FERA at the National Bee Unit and is now based at the University of Newcastle, together with other colleagues elsewhere, including from the National Bee Unit. And he's looking at chronic bee paralysis virus, and the title says it's a serious emerging threat to honeybees. And this term of an emerging disease is quite a trendy one, and I think probably you stand a better chance of getting your grant application succeed if you talk about the pathogen you're working on as an emerging disease. And curiously, he doesn't mention the Isle of Wight disease at all, or really mention that actually it's been around in Britain for quite a long time. But what he's done is he's looked at data from bee-base, from bee inspections over a long period of time, and looked at chronic bee paralysis. And this is one of the graphs, and the top one looking at number of apiaries recorded with chronic bee paralysis virus. It does indeed seem to show that over the 10 years from 2007 to 2017, there was a very considerable increase increase in the incidence of the disease in England and Wales. And the bottom graph is quite interesting too, because it splits the inspections into what it terms amateurs and professionals. So amateur beekeepers and bee farmers, really. And interestingly, it seems to show, or indeed does quite conclusively show, that the professional beekeepers seem to have a higher incidence of the disease than the amateur beekeepers. And that might perhaps be something to do with the fact that professional beekeepers, bee farmers, tend to keep more colonies in one site than do amateurs. And I said already that there seems to have been a historical association with high densities of colonies and the disease. Interestingly, as the National Bee Unit has access to data showing who has imported queens into Britain and where they went, analysis of the data showed that beekeepers who had recently imported queens had a higher incidence of the disease than those that didn't. And this is really shown quite well in this other diagram here, looking at the distribution of reports of chronic bee paralysis virus from 2007 to 2017. And you can see it generally appears to increase, but it's a slightly unusual pattern. And you, for example, here have a sudden outbreak of the disease where there was no incidence before, and then over the next few years this disappears, and then you have other outbreaks that appear and disappear. And this does indeed appear consistent with a new disease coming from somewhere else. It certainly doesn't suggest a disease appearing in one place and spreading throughout the country from a point source. And this is another way of looking at the data, looking at the relative risk compared to what you would expect from previous inspection data. And this indeed also shows this long-term trend, and also these hotspots that appear miraculously in places where there was no disease before, and then over a number of years disappear again. So there clearly does seem to be some association with those who've imported bees.